The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am incredibly honoured to rise in support of Bill C-262 and of my colleague from Abitibi, Baie-James, Nunavik, Eeyou. Much has already been said about this bill, but as we embark on the third and final reading, I would like to pay tribute to the sponsor of this bill. At age 7, he was among 27 Cree children taken from their homes, their families, their communities to attend residential school in La Tuque. He remained there for 10 years. After leaving residential school and returning to his home community, he attended a meeting on the negotiations between the Cree government officials on constitutional and resource rights, which sparked his interest in pursuing a law degree. He attended law school at the Université du Québec at Montreal, and in 1989 he became the first Cree to receive a law degree in Quebec. This was the beginning of a life's work representing and advancing the human rights and the well-being of the Cree people. And most notably, and given the bill and debate today, 30 years ago, the member for Abitibi, Baie-James, Nunavik, Eeyou, was invited to the United Nations to negotiate the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is humbling to sit alongside such a distinguished member of this House and an honour to call him a colleague. Indigenous people is what this bill is about. It provides a legislative framework to ensure no government going forward can deny human rights, basic human rights to the First Peoples of Canada. Article 1 of the UN Declaration states, Indigenous peoples have the right to full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international human rights law. Indigenous peoples in Canada live in a world where their basic human rights have to be affirmed distinctly in international treaties and declarations. Basic rights and freedoms taken for granted and afforded and enjoyed by non-Indigenous Canadians, with few exceptions. Just last week, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the right to vote being conferred on women, well, some women anyway, white, middle-class, propertied women. The right to vote was not granted to Indigenous people by the Canadian government until 1960. The laws of Canada are not in harmony with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And despite Section 35 of our Constitution that recognizes and affirms Indigenous rights, our governments have not recognized these rights, and instead, government after government has forced Indigenous peoples into lengthy, expensive court battles to have their constitutional rights respected and acted upon. The legacy of colonization and the denial of rights to Indigenous peoples is alive and well. Canada was an active participant in drafting the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People over a period of 2 decades. And as I mentioned earlier, the member for Abitibi, Baie-James, Nunavik, Eeyou played an important role in the drafting. Despite that work, Canada opted to oppose the adoption of the Declaration in 2007. On May 10, 2016, at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada stated, "Today we are addressing Canada's position on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I am here to announce on behalf of Canada that we are now in full support of the Declaration without qualification." Then in November of last year, the Minister of Justice announced that the government would support Bill C-262 and that the bill acknowledges the application of the UN Declaration in Canada and calls for the alignment of the laws of Canada with the UN Declaration. This indeed was welcome news, Mr. Speaker, because we cannot move forward and take our place among honourable nations if we do not acknowledge our past and work to make the future a complete repudiation of our past treatment of Indigenous peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee has called upon the federal government, among others, to fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. The TRC has included the UN Declaration in 16 calls to action. Indigenous people have been waiting for a long time for the collective rights of Aboriginal peoples living in Canada, including their inherent rights to traditional lands and territories, self-determination, and recognition of culture and language. They are still waiting for equal treatment under the law. They continue to wait for clean water, equitable funding for education, social services and health care, decent housing, communities free of mercury, PCBs, pesticides, free of tuberculosis and dysentery. The Indigenous peoples of Canada must not be an afterthought, treated as second-class citizens in law, in policy, or in practice. I'd like to close with a quote from Douglas White, Councillor and Chief Negotiator for the Sunamau First Nation, which I probably mispronounced. I apologize. UNDRIP is important because it is a comprehensive framework of recognition and reconciliation, a paradigm we have no domestic tradition of in Canada. Our future must be built on putting in place new foundations, including in legislation and in policy. Bill C-262 starts that process and builds the new path, and we should all support it. Thank you, and miigwech.
Resuming